Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently, we are in Deuteronomy chapter 23 on our way to Moses' final days. Oh, actually, final day, but to close the book of Deuteronomy. And let me also say this: the book of Deuteronomy was sort of the cliffhanger notes, you could say, the kind of shortened version, in the nutshell version of the law, that the kings were to keep all the days of their lives to read from it. And so this was sort of, in a nutshell, you could read kind of like I say, the general rules of the law without necessarily going through the entire 613 commandments of the law. So they make for good reading to capture, if you wanted to do a quick study of the law, then Deuteronomy is it. Now, let's keep in mind, this was Moses' compelling exhortation, final address to Israel to stay with the law, but it also served. Some people call it the second law, but it's not really the second law at all. It was Moses' final address. All right, so let's get into it. All right. Verse 1 says, "No man whose testicles have been crushed or whose penis has been cut off may enter the Lord's assembly." Now, I want to stop. This is a very interesting verse here, these few verses. So some of the ways you can probably say that if you just read it for face value, it almost seems like, is he saying that a person whose, for example, testicles have been crushed or penis been cut off, he's maimed, so is he excluded? And this particular passage here is not clear. Other passages would kind of indicate that the result could be from some kind of paganism. That was one aspect of it. But as we're going to see, there are some other kind of things here that when we talk about these statements here, these commands of who can enter the assembly of the Lord. Some would say marriage. Again, this passage here is not specifically spelling it out. Other passages tie in pagan worship and practices to some of these, but as we're going to see in the next verse, illegitimate birth, or what we call bastard kids. In other words, the kids themselves were to be punished. But again, so it's not clear as to the extent of this, the severity of it. Okay, so let's just go and read. So anyway, a person who has, of course, damaged genitals. Okay. Verse 2, "No one of illegitimate birth may enter the Lord's assembly. None of his descendants, even to the 10th generation, may enter the Lord's assembly." But in recent times, we'd call these bastard kids, right? But anyway, if you were not a product of a God marriage, that's the point there, a godly marriage. You may also want to keep in mind that even if you were the product of a two-parent home, but you were the Moabite, you still was excluded. So you need to be careful how you want to interpret this. Verse 3, "No Amorite or Moabite may enter the Lord's assembly. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, may enter the Lord's assembly." This is because they did not meet you with food and water on the journey after you came out of Egypt, and because of Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in Aram Naham, and Nehiram, was hired to curse you. Yet the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but he turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Never seek their peace or prosperity as long as you live. So again, I think sometimes the context makes it sort of clear with some of this. Let me just say this, as far as like Ruth with the Moabite. So when someone turns to the Lord and and embraced the God of Israel, they were accepted. So the idea, it seems to be more so those outside of the covenant of God, living outside of the covenant of God, practicing things outside of the covenant of God, where this severe, kind of severe command was issued. Okay, verse 7, do not despise an Edomite, because he is your brother. And do not despise an Egyptian, because you were a foreign resident in his land. The children born to them in the third generation may enter the Lord's assembly. All right, verse 9. When you're encamped against your enemies, be careful to avoid anything offensive. If there is a man among you who is unclean because of bodily emissions during the night, he must go outside the camp. He may not come anywhere inside the camp. Now, when he's referring to bodily emissions, he's talking about semen. So you can sort of fill in the blanks if you want to as to why he had these kinds of bodily emissions. Verse 11, when even, actually, also let me say this too, typically urine and bowel movements also may also apply. Verse 11, when evening approaches, he must wash with water, and when the sun sets, he may come inside the camp. You must have a place outside the camp and go there to relieve yourself. You must have a digging tool in your equipment when you relieve yourself. Dig a hole with it and cover up your excrement. So notice how God, a lot of people may go amen to that if you was camping, he says don't just leave your excrement outside, if I may be so bold as to say when you walk your dog, but I admit I'm interjecting that, okay? Verse 14, for the Lord your God walks through your camp to protect you and deliver your enemies to you. So your encampment must be holy. He must not see anything improper among you, or he return away from you. Do not return a slave, verse 15, do not return a slave to his masters when he has escaped from his master to you. Let him live among you whenever he wants within your gates. Do not mistreat him. Kind of interesting thing here. Paul used the principle of this verse when he wrote the letter to Philemon. So it makes a very interesting read, the book of Philemon. Okay, and Paul actually uses this principle here. Verse 17. No Israelite woman is to be a cult prostitute, and no Israelite man is to be a cult prostitute. So in a sense, both gay and female prostitutes. And these were done in a sense with pagan worship. In other words, people would go in most pagan practices had some type of sexual perversion in them. And cult prostitutes was one of them. Verse 18, do not bring a female prostitute's wages or a male prostitute's earnings into the house of the Lord your God to fulfill any vow, because both are detestable to the Lord your God. Now this is very interesting here. Notice this. This kind of money wasn't to be used as an offering. Do not charge your brother interest on money, food, or anything that can earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you must not charge your brother interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you do in the land that you are possessing. And by the way, your brother referred to any Israelite, okay? Anyone within the land that was your neighbor, okay? Verse 21, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to keep it, because he will require it of you, and it will be counted against you excuse me, as sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, it will not be counted against you as sin. Be careful to do whatever comes from your lips, because you have freely vowed what you promised to the Lord your God. One of the best things to do is just don't make these vows. We're going to see a couple examples later on where people made foolish vows and paid dear prices for them. So in other words, the best thing is don't make a vow. When you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you are full, but you must not put any in a container. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads of grain with your hands, but you must not put a sickle in your neighbor's grain. Now, two things about this. One, in other words, he said, have a heart. There are some people that don't want you to touch anything, right? But another thing about this is that when you read the Gospels, and remember the Pharisees saw Jesus plucking his, the disciples eating the grains of the corn. Well, they were doing that in keeping of this command. In other words, you were free to do that. You just could not gather it or store it up. You know, like a buffet meal. Like the all-you-can-eat buffets, right? You go there and you pay, of course, but you eat as much as you can, but you can't bring your Tupperware and take any home. Well, the idea is that they were trying to say that Jesus never breaking the Sabbath day when they was eating it, but they wasn't. As you can see right here, the law of Moses, which the Pharisees failed to say, allowed you to do that. You can eat. Notice he says, as much as you want, but you cannot. You cannot eat that. All right, let's go on to Deuteronomy chapter 24. That if a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him, he finds something improper about her, he may write her a divorce certificate, hand it to her, and send her away from his house. If after leaving, now let me stop and say this, because this really becomes confused, a source of confusion. Now keep this in mind. This is the law of Moses divorcement. Okay, he's going to later tell us what is the only reason they could divorce then. Now remember the previous chapter, if a man hates his wife, he couldn't divorce just based upon that. We also read if a person raped someone that he had to marry her, and he was forced to marry her. So what he's saying is that the reason why God is going to give the commandment of divorce is only one, is for adultery. So Jesus would quote from this, but he would and then go on to even say, now, but Moses is giving this for the hardness of your heart. All right, so verse 2 says, if after leaving his house she goes and becomes another man's wife, the second man hates her, writes her a divorce certificate, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house, or if he dies, the first husband who sent her away may not marry her again, for she has been defiled, because that would be detestable to the Lord. You must not bring guilt on the land the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. Then it says that when a man takes a bride, he must not go out with the army or be liable for duty. He is free to stay home with her for 1 year so that he can bring joy to his wife. He is married. So, in other words, with this command, newlyweds were able to live at least a year before going out. Especially during a time of war, you can see that the risk of getting killed. Okay, verse 6, do not take a pair of millstones or an upper millstone, that's security for debt, because it is like taking a life as security. If a man is discovered kidnapping one of his Israelite brothers, whether he treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. He must purge evil from you. Be careful in the case of an infectious skin disease. Follow carefully everything the Levitical priest instructs you to do. And of course, we read that in the book of Leviticus. Be careful to do as I commanded them. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the journey after you left Egypt. Now, one of the things they did that Israel, she had to stay outside the camp for 7 days, even though she was healed. Miriam had to stay outside the camp. This was back in Numbers chapter 12 when they confronted Moses, and then as a result of that, God judged Miriam with leprosy. He then healed her, but she still had to stay outside for 7 days. Verse 10. When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not enter his house to collect what he offers as security. You must stand outside You must stand outside while the man you are making a loan to brings the security out to you. If he is a poor man, you must not. If he is a poor man, you must not sleep in the garment he has given the security. Be sure to return it to him at sunset. Then he will sleep in it and bless you, and this will be counted as righteousness to you before the Lord your God. Now, there's a lot of things about greed, okay, that it could be said here. And notice that God is taking the time to give the commandments. Don't mistreat people. Even with these commandments, they still did it. You think about how the poor is treated now, right? The poor, with loans and different things like that. Verse 14, do not oppress an hired hand who is poor and needy, whether one of your brothers or one of the foreigners residing within your town, in your land. You are to pay him his wages each day before the sun sets, because he is poor and depends on them. Otherwise, he will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be held guilty. Again, a lot of this we can add from this. It's kind of funny that a lot of people do say how we based our laws on biblical principles. How many people fight against paying wages? Decent wages? Anyway, verse 16, fathers are not to be put to death for the children, or the children for the fathers. Each person will be put to death for his own sin. Now, remember, this is a clarity to some of the other verses. We're talking about holding guilt to the third and fourth generation, but people forget the last statement of that command, to those that hate me. So that's the key here. Here is the general command. No one is to be put to death for someone else's sin. The fathers is not to be put to death for the children's sins, nor the children for the fathers' sins. Verse 17. Do not deny justice to a foreigner or a fatherless child. Do not take a widow's garment as security. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. Okay, so verse 19. When you reap the harvest of your field, and you forget a sheaf in the field, do not go back and get it. It is to be left for the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your work of your hands. And when you knock down the fruit from your olive tree, you must not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow. When you gather your grapes of your vineyard, you must not glean what is left. What remains will be for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. Now, some of this is I think it's freezing up here. All right. When you think about labor relations, labor, things like that, isn't it interesting how God looks out for those who are poor? In other words, one, there are people that are living today that would do exactly what God is saying not to do here. There are people that would withhold wages. There are people, he's not through, by the way, but there are people that would withhold wages and everything. And so the fact that God has to command this, notice he says, the term gleaning a field. We'll read this when we come to the book of Ruth. As a poor person, that's what she would do. He said, look, and Boaz was a righteous man who would do that. But many people weren't as righteous. Many people, truthfully, were evil. They were evil. And this is what God was saying here. Now, another thing is, too, in this sort of kind of social command, there is a welfare system set up. But notice that they were to work for that. That nowhere do you see, except a person that's sick, right? But nowhere is it ever that welfare is to be given to people free of charge, that they don't do nothing. That's just bad. In other words, what he is telling the landowners, leave it for them. It was then up for the people to go and work for that, to glean and to pick their own fruit and what's left over. Okay? So that the poor was provided for, but they also had to work for it. All right, guys. I will see you in chapter 24 in the next study. I'll see you then.